Are you ready for a deep dive into what made some Asian economies tick?
Like a well-oiled auto rickshaw.
Exactly, like a well-oiled auto rickshaw.
You're right.
Today is all about How Asia Works by Joe Studwell, a book packed with insights into this dynamic region's success and failures.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're talking serious economic transformation here.
Yeah.
Think Japan's post-war miracle,
Yeah.
South Korea's tech dominance, China's meteoric rise,
Right.
but also why some countries got left behind.
Yeah.
This book goes beyond the usual headlines and reveals those surprising but consistent patterns that separate the winners from the also-rans.
It's relevant even today, no matter what your economic background is.
Okay, so let's unpack one of the most surprising factors, something called household farming.
Okay.
Now, this isn't your typical farming.
Yeah.
It's about maximizing output from limited land. Imagine highly productive gardening, but on a national scale.
Exactly. Higher yields mean more income for rural folks, and that sparks broader economic activity. Studwell argues this was key in Northeast Asia.
But here's the kicker. Places like the Philippines actually had more arable land,
Right.
better climate,
Yeah.
yet they relied on these massive, inefficient plantations.
Yeah.
What gives?
Power dynamics, my friend.
Okay.
In many Southeast Asian countries, land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy elites, so the benefits of this potential agricultural boom went to a select few, not the masses.
Right.
Without widespread prosperity, you don't get that surge in demand that fuels broader economic growth.
Got it.
It's not just about the land itself, but about who controls the land and how it's farmed.
All right, makes sense. Now, let's shift gears to manufacturing. It seems like this is where countries either took off or got stuck, assembling cheap goods for others.
This is where it gets interesting.
Oh,
This section dives into the nitty-gritty of industrial policy. You might be surprised to hear that government intervention played a crucial role in the success stories.
hold on. Isn't government meddling in the economy usually considered a bad thing?
That's the common perception, yes. But in the early stages of development, targeted government support can be crucial. Think of it like protecting a fledgling industry until it's strong enough to compete on a global scale. Japan, South Korea, later, China, they all used this approach. They forced their companies to become world-class through exports.
So it's like a parent teaching a kid to ride a bike. You hold on at first, but eventually they're off on their own. There was discipline involved.
Lots of it. It wasn't about coddling companies. It was about setting high standards and pushing them to achieve those standards, like take Malaysia's car project. They had big dreams, big ambitions, but they remained reliant on foreign technology and never truly innovated.
A cautionary tale about misguided ambition.
Precisely. Now let's talk about another critical factor, finance. And I'm not just talking about balancing budgets, but about directing capital to where it's needed most.
So in the successful countries, banks weren't just handing out loans left and right.
Absolutely not. They kept a tight leash on, where money flowed less about real estate speculation, more about investing in key industries that were driving development.
This tight leash sounds a lot like what economists call financial repression, right? Where governments have a lot of control over the financial system.
Exactly. Now, this approach can have its downsides. Too much control can stifle innovation. But when done right, it lays the foundation for incredible growth by channeling resources to where they can have the biggest impact.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Right. And that brings us to, you guessed it, the elephant in the room.
China.
China.
They've achieved mind-boggling growth, but I'm guessing there's more to the story.
China has definitely learned from those Northeast Asian models, especially in terms of state-led industrial policy and managing its financial system. But their private sector is struggling to compete with those global giants. Sounds familiar.
You're talking about Taiwan?
Yes. Remember how their private sector also struggled to catch up? It's a common challenge for late developers, even those who have successfully navigated those initial hurdles. And it raises a question about whether China is truly on a sustainable path.
So it's like graduating from development boot camp, but then realizing that the real test has just begun.
Yeah. Exactly. It makes you wonder if these policies work so well for some, why haven't they been replicated more widely?
Food for thought, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's so much more to unpack from this book.
Let's dive deeper into some of those individual journeys to see how these development strategies played out in the real world, starting with Japan. All right, so you ready to journey to the heart of these Asian economies with us?
You bet. Japan seems like a good place to start.
Indeed, the book takes us all the way back to the Meiji Restoration, way before any international development organizations were around. Japan was figuring things out on its own. What's fascinating is that even back then, they understood the importance of land reform.
So they set the stage for their industrial revolution through those early agricultural reforms.
Exactly. They were dealing with a largely rural population, but by empowering those farmers through land redistribution, they unlocked a tremendous amount of productivity and created a more equitable society. They drew inspiration from models like Prussia, who also used a land reform strategy to great success.
And then came their approach to manufacturing, which is really mind-blowing. They didn't shy away from protecting their industries, but they also made sure those industries were exposed to global competition.
That's the crucial point. It wasn't about creating a bubble for domestic companies to get complacent. They used tariffs and subsidies to support their industries, yes, but also push them to export and constantly innovate.
So it's like that tough love approach we talked about earlier.
Precisely. But even in Japan, there were tensions. Studwell highlights how those massive family-controlled conglomerates, the zaibatsu, tried to game the system, focusing more on protected domestic markets rather than pursuing exports. That's something we see throughout the book, this tension between big businesses with their own interests and the government's broader industrial policy goals.
Okay, so Japan set the stage now. Let's fast forward to post-war Korea.
Yes, under Park Chung-hee, South Korea went through a truly incredible transformation, and they did it by applying some of the same principles, but in a very different political context under an authoritarian regime.
The book doesn't sugarcoat the realities of Park's rule, but you can't deny that he was laser-focused on industrialization.
And he was definitely not afraid to pick winners and losers. Take P.O. Esco, the steel giant, for example. They were built from the ground up with massive government support and a relentless drive to master the technology. They refused to use computerized control systems at first because they wanted their engineers to understand every single detail of the steelmaking process. That's commitment.
Talk about hands-on learning.
Right. And then there's the Hyundai story. I mean, going from a construction company to a global automotive powerhouse, it's incredible.
It's the ultimate underdog story. They were told they were crazy for even attempting to build cars, but they proved everyone wrong.
It wasn't just ambition, it was discipline. It was about relentlessly pushing themselves to achieve those export goals that the government had set. And the government was very clear about what they wanted to become, a global player in the automotive industry.
These stories really show how government support, when combined with a company's own drive, can create global giants.
Right. But now let's shift gears geographically to Southeast Asia, where things get a little more, well, complicated.
I'm sensing a but coming.
You're right. Countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines had similar ambitions, but they often fell short of those Northeast Asian success stories, and a big part of it comes down to how they manage their finances. Remember that concept of financial repression we talked about earlier?
Where governments keep a tight rein on the financial sector.
Exactly. Well, Southeast Asia went through periods of financial liberalization and, shall we say, some misadventures. Studwell argues that these economies often failed to direct capital to those crucial sectors that were driving development. Instead of channeling funds towards industries and exports, as Korea and Japan had done, they experienced
Property booms, speculation, maybe even a bit of crony capitalism.
Bingo, and that led to a lot of bad, debt-inefficient industries and ultimately slower economic growth.
So it's not just about having the right industries, it's about having the right financial architecture to support them. And it's about avoiding those speculative bubbles that can really derail an economy.
And that brings us full circle back to China.
The giant in the room, they've achieved incredible growth, but it sounds like their story is much more nuanced.
Absolutely. They've managed to build up some incredibly powerful state-owned enterprises, but the book highlights challenges facing their private sector.
So they have the industries, but are they struggling to compete with those global giants?
Right. It's also familiar. Think about Taiwan.
You're saying that even though they've achieved remarkable things, they're not immune to those pitfalls that have plagued other developing economies.
China's story is still unfolding.
Okay, so Japan and Korea show us the potential of these development models, while Southeast Asia serves as a cautionary tale.
Now we're left wondering if China will be able to forge its own unique path, or will they end up repeating some of those same mistakes?
I guess only time will tell, but there's another critical piece to this whole puzzle that I think we need to explore further. What about the role of education in all of this?
Yes. The age-old debate is education, the key to development. What does the book say about that?
So we've seen how land reform, industrial policy, and financial control played out in different Asian economies. But what about education? Is that the secret ingredient in this whole development recipe?
Well, the book takes a nuanced approach to that. It argues that education is definitely important, but not the be-all and end-all that some people make it out to be.
So it's not as simple as just pumping out more graduates.
Right. Studwell emphasizes the importance of having the right kind of education, particularly vocational training, especially in those early stages of industrialization. He points out how in some Southeast Asian countries, there was this overemphasis on traditional academic subjects and not enough focus on those practical skills needed in growing industries.
So it's about aligning education with economic goals makes sense. But going back to those countries that did experience rapid growth, are they facing any new challenges now that they've graduated from that development phase?
That's a great question, and you're right, the book doesn't just stop at those early success stories in the final chapters. Studwell grapples with the challenges facing those late developers, even the ones who navigated those initial hurdles successfully.
So it's like acing the first few levels of a video game and then realizing the boss battles are only getting tougher.
Exactly. He talks about how countries like Japan and Korea, despite their achievements, are struggling with things like income inequality, corporate dominance, and maintaining their technological edge in a world that's constantly evolving.
It's like they're on this treadmill of innovation, constantly having to push boundaries or risk falling behind.
And what's really interesting is that he critiques some of those same policies that help these countries get ahead in the first place, things like infant industry protections. Those directed investments, he argues, they can become a hindrance if you're not careful.
So what worked for them at one stage might not work later on.
Okay.
Think about that example he used about the overpriced apples in Japan. Those perfect shiny apples that cost a fortune because of all those agricultural subsidies.
Brilliant example. It perfectly illustrates how policies can become distorted over time, even those with good intentions.
It highlights the need for adaptation and constant reassessment, right? You can't just stick to the same playbook forever.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, the big question that everyone wants to know is, can other regions replicate this Asian miracle? Can countries in Africa or Latin America follow a similar path?
That's the million-dollar question. So what's the verdict?
Studwell doesn't give a simple yes or no answer. He acknowledges that East Asia had its own unique circumstances historically and culturally, but he also argues that there are valuable lessons to be learned.
But he's not naive enough to think there's some magic formula that you could just copy and paste, right?
Definitely not. He emphasizes the importance of understanding your own country's unique strengths and weaknesses and tailoring those development strategies accordingly. He also cautions against blindly following any single ideology or economic dogma.
So it's more about principles and adaptability than a rigid blueprint.
Right, and he ends the book with this thought-provoking question that really stuck with me. Why, if these policies were so successful in East Asia, haven't they been replicated more widely?
That's a great question. It makes you think about the bigger picture, about global power dynamics, the challenges facing developing economies, and how all of those factors influence what's possible.
This book isn't just about economics, it's about understanding those complex forces that shape our world.
I think that's what makes How Asia Works such a compelling read. It goes beyond the surface level explanations and really challenges you to think critically.
It's a book that stays with you.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from those early agricultural reforms to the rise of industrial powerhouses and the ongoing challenges of development.
We've seen how government intervention can be a powerful tool for growth, but also how it can lead to distortions and unintended consequences.
And we've learned that there's no single path to success. What works in one context might not work in another.
But the key takeaway, for me at least, is that understanding these economic principles can help us make sense of not just Asia, but the world around us.
So if this deep dive has piqued your interest, I highly recommend checking out How Asia Works for yourself. It's a fascinating exploration of history, economics, and development that will leave you with a lot to think about.
And that, my friend, is the beauty of a deep dive.
Until next time.